Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Brian Saul. Joining me today is Morgan Borenstein. She is a business development manager within healow. And today, we're very glad to have her here with us because we are going to be discussing some new enhancements that have come along for telehealth. And in particular, we want to talk a little bit about healow, what's called healow Meet. So thank you, Morgan, for joining us. It's very much appreciated, as I mentioned.
Me?
Now, most people know that eCW has had telehealth for several years, well before the pandemic hit. But it was when the pandemic hit that it became that much more important to practices across the country. But it wasn't really robust enough in some ways to be able to handle all of the issues that practices were having. So, Morgan, can you tell us a couple of the problems that may have shown up before these enhancements that we're going to discuss in a moment came along?
Sure, Brian. So what we actually saw were a lot of the common issues that arose around the pandemic, where a lot of offices were closing. Obviously, unfortunately, a lot of the illnesses were increasing. So there was a dramatic increase in the need for televisit appointments. And really at that time, our healow team started conducting daily televisit webinars so that our practices and providers could actually fully set up televisits on their own and begin conducting these virtual visits with their patients. So, like Brian, you mentioned, several new enhancements have come out for healow televisits to really meet the needs of our providers and their patients. And so we can cover some of those at this point if you would like. Otherwise, we can talk about some of the new televisit features and healow Meet here in just a few moments.
Let's talk about both. Just give us an overview of the new functionality that's available that is really applicable and very, very helpful to practices that are currently using telehealth.
Absolutely. So starting with those new televisit features that we now offer, first of all, there's a quick solution for providers to get set up and running with televisits. It's called the 5-step wizard. So it's really just a one-stop shop with 5 quick steps to set up the providers and get them available to use televisits with their patients. So that's been a really easy way to get our providers set up at this point. We now allow providers and staff to send a message to patients while they're in the virtual waiting room. So even though the connection between the provider and patient hasn't started yet, there's now an option for the provider or staff member to communicate with the patient, maybe if they're running a few minutes behind, or they just need to communicate something to the patient before they actually connect with the audio and video with the patient. So that's another great feature we now offer.
That's a wonderful feature. And it's something I know that a lot of practices have been asking for. So what you're saying is that previously it had to be the provider that started the actual telehealth session. Now, however, another staff member can come in, let's say it's an MA or a nurse or whomever. They can start the visit, they can talk to the patient, perhaps gather information that they normally would gather or the doctor might have to gather during the initial call. So the doctor can then just simply come in, join the call with all the information that he needs up front.
Exactly. They can actually not only send them a message before the connection even starts, but like you said, Brian, the staff member can actually start the televisit itself with the patient as well, gather all of that initial information that would benefit the provider to possibly know ahead of time, and then the provider can join when they're ready. So that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So the last televisit feature, the new feature that I'd like to highlight is now there's an option for not only the provider, but also the patient to invite up to 2 new contacts to join the televisit. So even though a televisit is essentially the provider or a staff member at this point communicating with their patient, if another member needs to be added to that ongoing conversation, like maybe a translator, a therapist, or possibly a family member that needs to be involved in that conversation, both the provider or the patient can actually invite up to 2 new contacts to join that ongoing visit, just so they have that third party involved if necessary.
So is there anything else before we move on to healow Meet?
I think that's the perfect transition into healow Meet.
So my understanding is that, well, why don't you explain what healow Meet is?
Sure. Absolutely. So it is one of our, telehealth solutions, but healow Meet is a brand new product. It basically allows for group televisit appointments. So multiple patients are able to join these group televisit appointments with their provider. And, one big difference is the patient is joining and they're still seeing just the provider. That's kind of their angle, but the provider can see multiple patients at once. And there's lots of different use cases that we'll get into for why practices would use healow Meet for group appointments. But really the benefit is if the provider is trying to communicate a message or some sort of session to multiple patients at once, we now have that capability through healow Meet group appointments.
So yeah, let's explore that a little bit more in terms of who would be the optimal users for that. I also want to discuss a little bit further on down the line documentation and how healow Meet meeting can be documented easily. So let's talk about some of the use cases that you just mentioned on who would be optimal users for this.
Absolutely. So most of our practices that we've spoken to and we've started getting them up and running to use healow Meet, they're looking to have possibly behavioral health appointments. That's one of the most common ways for practices or a need for practices to have group appointments, but even anything from counseling sessions, maybe a nutrition class. And we've actually seen several practices wanting to schedule more of like an educational session. So for example, an OB/GYN provider possibly having a class for expecting moms, or even a pediatrics provider offering a class for new moms that have children at this point. As we're continuing to kind of show this product to our customers, we're seeing lots of different use cases for it over time. So we're looking forward to seeing how our practices to continue using these types of group appointments. Just like you mentioned a little bit earlier, Brian, documentation can be done during a healow Meet visit, just like a televisit where the provider's meeting with the patient, they're documenting within the patient's note, right, during the visit or even right after. Same thing can happen during healow Meet. However, not only can the provider document for one patient's note, but there's actually templates we can help you build. So the patient, you're speaking to multiple patients and the provider is documenting for multiple patient progress notes at once. So
at the same time, that's fantastic.
Exactly, built-in documentation.
Fantastic. How does a client activate healow Meet?
Great question. So it's actually very similar to our healow TeleVisit product and our other on-demand activation products. So within the EMR, you can go to the on-demand activation window and simply activate healow Meet. The healow TeleVisit product does also have to be activated in order to activate healow Meet, but it's in the same window. And as soon as it's activated, you're automatically guided to the settings for healow Meet. And the great thing is that 5-step wizard that I mentioned, the quick 5-step activation process to get the provider set up, as well as all the other settings configurations. Those settings will also be within the 5-step wizard. So it's a really quick and easy setup. I would suggest, however, just to make sure that the practice is on, the most updated version and have access to all of the activation windows. If you are interested in implementing healow Meet or any of the new healow TeleVisit features, to create a support case on the customer portal. That way, one of our healow team members can reach out and we'll assist with the full implementation and ongoing support and training.
Oh, that's great. Now, I assume, though, it also requires a specific visit type. So just something to keep in mind that anytime you're setting up a visit type for a televisit, there is a box in the visit type down toward the bottom that you need to click off and to ensure that comes across as a televisit type.
Exactly, Brian. The televisit and healow Meet, like you said, if you have that televisit box checked off, healow Meet requires the CCMR checkbox as well. But if those are checked off for those types of visits, then that's going to allow the patient to join virtually. Of course, depending on the settings configuration, patients can join from a text message, an email, or by logging into the patient portal or healow app. But again, we have those various options just based on the patient's preference once the visit is actually set up for the patient to join.
And now the big question, what's the cost?
Great question. So the cost of healow Meet does differ from TeleVisit since they are two separate products. So healow Meet is $100 per provider per month only if there's usage. So if it's not being used, there's no charge, just like televisits. But again, there are two separate costs, and televisits does still remain $2 per visit or $50 for 250 minutes for the month.
Okay, that seems more than reasonable to me. Well, Morgan, I want to thank you again for joining us today. It was very insightful and very enlightening. And I'm hoping that a lot of folks who are seeing this are going to go out and take a look at the new functionality that we've added into televisits. If you're interested in seeing more of these podcasts, you can find them on iTunes podcasts, I believe is the new term, YouTube, and of course, myclinicalworks.com. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you again, Morgan, for joining us. We hope to see you soon. Have a great day.